It was a gray, overcast afternoon in September 1980. The kind of day where the clouds hung low and the wind carried a slight chill that hinted at the coming of autumn. In the small, sleepy town of Dyersville, Iowa, life moved slowly, as it always had. Children played in yards, neighbors exchanged greetings on their porches, and the streets were usually filled with the comforting rhythms of routine. But on that particular day, something would happen that would change the town forever. 9-year-old Matthew Clark, a curious and kind-hearted boy known for his shy smile and his love for adventure, had just finished a regular school day. He waved goodbye to his friends, strapped on his small blue backpack, and hopped on his bicycle to ride the familiar 3-block stretch back home. His mother had made his favorite grilled cheese for lunch earlier that morning, and it was waiting for him, warm and ready, at the kitchen table. He never made it home. Somewhere between the school gates and his quiet neighborhood street, Matthew vanished. Just disappeared. Without a sound, without a trace. His bike was discovered about an hour later by a passerby. It was found lying awkwardly on its side near an old drainage tunnel, one that hadn't been used in decades. Rust clung to its metal frame, and overgrown weeds partially blocked the opening. Most kids in the neighborhood avoided that tunnel. It had a reputation, one of eerie echoes, odd smells, and local legends that spoke of strange noises at night. The moment the bike was found, Matthew's parents were alerted. His mother rushed to the scene, panic spreading across her face as she dropped to her knees beside the abandoned bicycle. She called his name again and again, her voice cracking and rising with every shout. Neighbors came out of their homes. Some searched the nearby woods, others checked garages and basements. But nothing, no sign of struggle. No screams were heard. There were no skid marks, no scuffle in the dirt, not even a footprint in the soft ground nearby. Just silence, as if the boy had been lifted from the earth by invisible hands. The police were called immediately. An official search party was organized that very night. Dozens of officers and volunteers combed through every inch of the nearby area. They used flashlights, dogs, helicopters, even divers to search the small creek that wound its way past the tunnel. For days, the community didn't sleep. Posters with Matthew's photo, his bright eyes, his goofy smile, his Scooby-Doo t-shirt, were taped to storefronts, telephone poles, and car windows. The story made the local papers, then the regional news, and eventually even national coverage for a short while. But days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and nothing was found. Rumors began to spread. Some people whispered that Matthew had been kidnapped by someone passing through town. Others believed he'd fallen into the drainage system and drowned, even though no body was ever recovered. A few older folks revived the town's old legends, tales of the tunnel being cursed, haunted, or connected to something far darker than anyone wanted to admit. His parents refused to move on. His mother clung to hope with a desperate kind of strength, one that defied logic or time. Every night she left the porch light on and a candle burning in the window, believing that one day her son might return. She kept his room exactly as he had left it, bed made, toys neatly arranged, backpack still hanging on the doorknob. On his birthdays, she baked his favorite chocolate cake and placed one slice at the table for him. She told everyone that no matter how many years passed, she just knew he was still alive somewhere. His father, once a lively and talkative man, became distant. He rarely spoke after that day. He took early retirement and stopped going to community events. He spent most of his time tending the garden, avoiding eye contact with reporters, and keeping a framed photo of Matthew by his bedside. The photo was worn at the edges, but it was the last thing he looked at before sleeping, and the first thing he saw when waking. The town itself changed after the incident. A kind of invisible shadow hung over Dyersville. Parents became more protective. Children were no longer allowed to walk home alone. People locked their doors in broad daylight. That old drainage tunnel, once just a relic of the past, became a symbol of something unspoken. Most avoided it entirely. Some teenagers dared each other to approach it at night, but no one ever stayed near it for long. It gave people a feeling, like they were being watched, like something had been left unfinished. Years passed. New families moved in. The story of Matthew Clark faded from headlines and slowly slipped into the category of unsolved local mystery. But for those who had lived through it, who had seen the desperate searches and the grieving parents, it never really went away. It became a scar on the town's identity, one that never quite healed. Every once in a while, someone would claim to have seen a boy matching Matthew's description, on a bus in a different state, walking alone on a distant highway. Each tip was followed up, each lead chased down, but they always led to nothing. No body, no confession, no closure. And then, just like that, it had been 10 years, then 20, 30. By the time 45 years had passed, most people had stopped talking about it. The town had grown, modernized, changed. The tunnel had been sealed off with steel plates. New families drove past it every day without knowing what had happened there, what it had once meant. But for the Clark family, what was left of it? The wound had never closed. And in 2025, something would finally surface. Something hidden beneath the mud and roots and time. Something horrifying. The mystery that had haunted a town for nearly half a century was about to return, with answers no one was prepared to hear. Matthew's parents never gave up. In the quiet aftermath of his disappearance, when the search teams had packed up, the media had moved on, and the neighbors had stopped coming by with casseroles and comforting words, the Clark family was left alone with a hole that no one could fill. Their home, once filled with laughter, after-school chatter, and the background noise of cartoons and toys, turned into a place of silence, tension, and aching absence. Yet through all the darkness that crept into their lives, they refused to give in to the idea that their son was simply gone. On every birthday, without fail, they lit a candle and placed it by the window in Matthew's room. It was a tradition that began on his 10th birthday, just weeks after the incident, and continued year after year. The candle flickered late into the night, casting soft shadows across the pale blue walls of a room that had remained untouched. His mother always said the light was for Matthew, that if he were out there, somewhere, somehow, it would guide him home. She believed in that simple act the way a sailor believes in a lighthouse. That room became a kind of shrine. Matthew's bed stayed made, with the same comforter he'd loved, decorated with rockets and planets. His toys were neatly arranged on the shelves. His baseball glove, still a little stiff from when he was trying to break it in, sat on the windowsill. His clothes, slowly growing out of fashion and then becoming vintage with time, were still folded in his drawers. Nothing was thrown out. Not a single crayon, not a single drawing. To throw something away, his mother once said, would feel like throwing him away. They spent years searching. His father took on extra shifts and second jobs to afford private investigators. His mother clipped newspaper articles about sightings, disappearances, and anyone claiming to have memories of Dyersville in the 1980s. They visited self-proclaimed mediums, drove to distant towns on the word of vague tips, and even appeared on local radio shows begging for information. They received dozens of calls. Some were genuine. Most were hoaxes or cruel pranks. Each time the phone rang, their hearts jumped with a possibility, only to break all over again when it led nowhere. As time passed, the world outside their home kept moving forward. Technology advanced. The internet arrived. People started communicating differently. But for the Clarks, life stood still. They didn't get smartphones. They didn't join social media. They stayed in their old house, as if moving would mean accepting that Matthew might never walk through that front door again. In 1994, after 14 years of searching, a man came forward claiming to have seen a boy matching Matthew's description in another state. He was convinced it was him. The boy even had a small scar above his left eyebrow, just like Matthew had. The Clarks flew out immediately, but when they arrived, the child was not their son. He was a runaway from another town, frightened and confused, but not Matthew. His mother cried in the airport bathroom for nearly an hour, clutching the empty frame she had brought to put a new photo in. Despite everything, she kept believing. She was always the one to hold on to hope, even when everyone else had let it go. Her friends gently suggested that maybe it was time to accept reality. Her sister once told her she needed to find peace. But Matthew's mother would always respond the same way. You don't bury someone without a body. She refused to let the world tell her what to feel. In 2004, after nearly 24 years of hoping, she passed away quietly in her sleep. She had been ill for some time, but never let on how serious it was. In her final weeks, she still sat by the window at dusk, looking out at the street, watching for a figure that never came. On her bedside table were two things: a worn-out candle wick in a glass holder, and a folded drawing Matthew had made in second grade. It showed their house, with a stick-figure family holding hands and smiling. The sun in the corner had a face. Underneath, in crayon, were the words, "Home is the best place." Her funeral was small. She hadn't kept in touch with many people, but those who came remembered her as the mother who never gave up, the woman who believed in her child until the very end. Her husband was never the same after that. He had already been withdrawing from the world for years, but now it was as if something inside him fully shut down. He stopped speaking to almost everyone. He declined visitors. He wouldn't go to events or holidays. The only time he left the house was for groceries or to tend to the garden, something Matthew's mother had loved. He never changed the curtains, never rearranged the furniture. It was like time had pressed pause on the home. He kept only one photograph of Matthew by his bedside. It had been taken a few months before the disappearance. In it, Matthew was wearing a red and white striped t-shirt, smiling with a missing front tooth, and holding a popsicle. His hair was slightly messy, and he had just come back from riding his bike. That photo had bent corners and a crease through the middle, but it was the last true moment he had of his son, and he kept it close. Each night, before lying down, he would stare at the photo in silence. Sometimes he would whisper a soft "Good night, Matt." Other times, nothing, just the slow, quiet grief that had become his companion. No longer loud or desperate, just a constant ache. People in town often wonder how he was doing, but few dared to ask. The older generation remembered the couple's pain and gave him space. The younger generation barely knew the story anymore. The house became one of those places people pointed at and said, "That's where the boy's family lived." But to him, it wasn't a landmark, it was a waiting room. A place frozen in time until anything changed. And so the years rolled on. Seasons passed. The world kept moving. But inside that house, a father waited. Not with hope, necessarily. Not with expectation. But with a quiet sort of endurance. Like someone who refuses to leave the window open not because they think someone's coming, but because they made a promise to never close it. A promise born from love, from pain, from the need to believe that some part of their son, their little boy who rode off on his bicycle one rainy afternoon in 1980, was still out there, waiting to come home. Fast forward to 2025. Exactly 45 years after that rainy afternoon when Matthew Clark vanished without a trace. By now, most of the town had moved on. Dyersville had changed. New families had replaced the old ones. New stores stood where familiar shops once did. A generation had grown up hearing only fragments of the story. Some knew it as a local ghost tale told around campfires. Others had never heard Matthew's name at all. But for those few who remembered, really remembered, the shadow still lingered, even if unspoken. The old drainage tunnel where Matthew's bike was found had long since been sealed and forgotten. Weeds had overtaken the edges. Nature had done its best to reclaim the area. For decades, it remained untouched, just another forgotten corner on the outskirts of town. But in the spring of 2025, a construction crew was brought in to clear the land and lay down a new service road. Plans had been approved, budgets allocated, and the heavy machinery began to dig. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning. The crew had been breaking up soil and moving debris since dawn. One of the workers, a man named Carlos, noticed something odd beneath the scoop of the backhoe. The teeth had scraped against what looked like old metal, not just buried pipe or junk. This looked like a plate, flat, wide, and heavily rusted. Curious, he jumped down from the machine and waved over a colleague. Together, they began to dig around the edges with shovels, being careful not to damage whatever it was. The deeper they went, the stranger it got. The plate was almost fused into the ground, covered in thick roots, hardened clay, and decades of sediment. It took hours to clear it. By the time they had fully exposed the rectangular slab, the sun was dipping lower in the sky. The crew debated whether to leave it for the next day, but something about it wouldn't let them walk away. They pried the plate up using crowbars and hydraulic tools. As it groaned and shifted, the smell hit them first, a strange, sour mustiness like old mold and wet wood. Beneath the plate, to everyone's shock, was a small chamber. It wasn't a manhole or utility vault. This had no stairs, no entry point from above. It looked as if it had been built, or carved, intentionally, then sealed shut. The interior was dry, somehow protected from decades of storms and seasons. The walls were coated in dirt and grime, but inside the space sat something completely unexpected. A child's backpack, untouched by time. The backpack was small blue and had cartoon patches sewn into the sides, now faded but still recognizable. It was leaning upright against the far wall, as if someone had placed it there carefully. One of the men reached in with a gloved hand and gently lifted it. It was surprisingly light. Inside were a few items: a folded paper airplane, a granola bar still in its original wrapper, a broken pencil, and something unmistakable: a school ID badge with a name tag. Matthew Clark. Gasps filled the air. The mood among the crew shifted immediately. No longer was this just an odd historical find. This was a crime scene. The foreman called the authorities without hesitation. Within the hour, yellow tape surrounded the area, and police began arriving with lights flashing. But that wasn't all. As investigators carefully explored the chamber, someone spotted a second object tucked behind a crumbling corner. It was a small, red toy car, dusty but otherwise intact. One of its wheels was missing, and a sticker had peeled halfway off. To most, it looked like nothing more than an old toy. But to the few who remembered the case from 1980, it was impossible to ignore. Matthew had been known to carry a red car in his backpack. His mother had once described it in an interview. She said it was his favorite thing in the world. He called it Racer, and wouldn't go anywhere without it. It was clear now. This wasn't just some forgotten underground room. This was where Matthew had ended up. And then came the moment no one was ready for. The moment that turned this site from a historic recovery into something far darker. Wrapped in the corner of the chamber, partly buried under hardened dirt and decaying fabric, were small bones. Investigators paused, stared, then moved in with extreme care. The bones were delicate, brittle. They were arranged in a fetal position, curled as if the child had been cold or afraid. Around the remains was what appeared to be a school jacket, still clinging to fragments of color and stitching. Time had eaten away most of the material, but one detail remained: the letter M stitched on the collar. Silence overtook the crew. Even the officers stood still, struck by the heaviness of the moment. After 4.5 decades, the mystery of Matthew Clark's disappearance had finally broken open, but not in the way anyone had hoped. Forensics teams were called in, and over the following days, the site was thoroughly examined. The chamber itself was mapped and scanned, the contents removed and preserved. Every bone, every item, every scrap of cloth was catalogued. The red car was sealed in an evidence bag and sent for analysis, though everyone already knew what it was. DNA samples were taken from the bones and cross-referenced with those on file. It took less than a week to confirm what many already feared. The remains belonged to Matthew Clark. The boy who had vanished in 1980 had been buried in the very place where his bike had been found all those years ago. Hidden just beneath the surface, sealed away from the world. The story hit the news almost instantly. Headlines buzzed across the internet, sparking a resurgence of interest in the cold case. Reporters came to town, cameras followed the dig site, and old wounds were reopened for those who had lived through it. But amidst the chaos, the real weight of the discovery was felt not in news coverage or police reports, but in the hearts of the people. People gathered near the site, leaving flowers and candles. Some whispered prayers, others simply stood in silence. They couldn't stop thinking about that sealed chamber, about the backpack, about the tiny bones curled beneath the earth. What happened to Matthew? Why was he placed there? Who had built the chamber? And most terrifying of all, had he died alone, waiting in the dark? The answers were still unclear. But one thing was certain: the truth had finally begun to surface. And for Dyersville, the nightmare they thought had been buried was only just beginning to unfold. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours of the discovery, the story of Matthew Clark's remains being found after 45 long years ignited across every local media outlet. And before the day was over, it had reached national headlines. Reporters swarmed into Dyersville, trucks with satellite dishes parked along quiet streets, and camera crews stood outside the newly unearthed drainage site, speaking in solemn tones while lights glared in the faces of stunned townspeople. For the older residents, it felt like a wound that had never quite healed had been torn open all over again. Many remembered the original search, the tears of Matthew's mother on the evening news, the whispers in diners, and the fearful looks exchanged in grocery stores. For younger residents, it was a disturbing awakening, a reminder that their peaceful town held dark secrets beneath its surface, both literally and figuratively. The DNA results came back faster than expected. Advanced forensic technology, now decades beyond what had existed in 1980, confirmed with near-perfect certainty that the remains belonged to Matthew Clark. The town reacted with a strange mix of sorrow and relief. Sorrow because the hope, however faint, was finally gone. Relief because at last there were answers. Or so they thought. But that wasn't the end. In many ways, it was only the beginning. When forensic technicians cataloged the contents of Matthew's backpack, they discovered a notebook tucked into a small inside pocket. It was covered in dust and stained with age, but remarkably intact. The cover was plain, the kind sold in school supply aisles for a few cents. Inside, the first page was marked with a single sentence, written in large, uneven letters that seemed to shake with fear even across the passage of time. If you're reading this, I didn't die by accident. That sentence alone sent chills through the hearts of everyone who saw it. The handwriting was unmistakably that of a child, raw, unsteady, and real. The letters were faint in some places, pressed hard in others, as if written by someone trying desperately to get the words out. Investigators knew immediately they were holding something far more important than just a notebook. This was a message, a cry for help. a record of what had happened, written by a boy who knew no one was coming. What followed after that first page were dozens of short entries. Some were only a few lines long. Others stretched nearly to the edge of the paper. Each was written in the same hand, childlike, urgent, uneven. There were misspellings, crossed-out words, and smudges where the ink had been wiped or smeared, likely by tears or trembling fingers. The first entries were the most coherent. His teeth are yellow. He smells like smoke and the river. He took me when I was going home. I yelled, but he covered my mouth. I bit him. He hit me and put me in a bag. As the pages continued, the tone became increasingly fragmented. He lives in the walls down here. I hear him crawling. Sometimes he talks to the pipes. He said I can't leave. Said the light hurts him. I don't like the dark anymore. It has fingers. I miss Mom. I think it's night again. He's gone. I think he's watching through the drain hole. Some entries were more disturbing than others. There's someone else here. I hear crying. Maybe a girl. He gets mad when she cries. He hurts her. Please help us. Please. I keep trying to dig, but the floor is too hard. I can't scream anymore. My voice broke. The last few pages were barely readable. The handwriting degraded into almost scribbles. The sentences became shorter, more disjointed. Cold. Hungry. He's not back yet. Maybe he forgot about me. It's been days, I think. No sound. No food. Then finally, I'm tired. I think he's gone. Or maybe I'm gone. The notebook stopped there. No signature. No final message. Just a blank page, followed by more empty sheets that had never been written on. When authorities reviewed the notebook, it became painfully clear that Matthew hadn't died quickly. He had been alive for days, possibly weeks, trapped somewhere underground, likely within the very tunnel where he was eventually found. The nature of his death, whether it was starvation, exposure, or something worse, was still unclear. But the implication of the words in his own hand left no doubt that he had been held against his will, that he had been terrified, and that someone had done this to him. The notebook was shown to behavioral analysts, handwriting experts, and psychologists. Every expert agreed on one thing: this wasn't a hoax. The writing, the patterns of fear, the gradual decline in coherence, it was all consistent with extreme psychological trauma in a young child over a prolonged period. The contents of the notebook were not immediately made public. Investigators wanted time to understand what they had found, but word leaked, as it always does, and soon, pieces of the entries began circulating online. The phrase, "I didn't die by accident," appeared on blogs, on social media, on podcasts and forums. Some called it a ghost's diary. Others said it was the most heartbreaking piece of true crime evidence ever discovered. People from across the country came to Dyersville to visit the site. Though the chamber had been sealed again and marked as a restricted area, the edge of the property became an unofficial memorial. People left flowers, candles, drawings, and notes. Children's toys began appearing in growing numbers. A small cross was hammered into the soil nearby, with the name Matthew carved into it by hand. The notebook had done something no police report or news story ever could. It had given Matthew a voice. After 45 years of silence, of theories, of fading memories, he had spoken. And what he said wasn't just tragic. It was horrifying. The case was no longer just about a boy who vanished. It was about a child who suffered in silence, recorded every moment he could, and tried desperately to be found. A boy who died knowing no one was coming. Not because they didn't care, but because they didn't know. The pressure on authorities intensified. If Matthew had been writing about another child, someone else crying in the dark, then the horrifying truth was that he might not have been the only one. Investigators began re-examining missing children cases from the area. every file from the late 1970s to early 1980s was pulled. Psychologists worked alongside law enforcement to identify patterns, connections, possible suspects. And through it all, the notebook remained a haunting center of attention. People cried while reading it. Teachers brought it up in classrooms as a lesson about safety. Parents held their children a little tighter. And for the Clark family, what was left of it? It was both the answer they had waited for and the nightmare they had hoped to never confirm. 45 years of silence, broken by the scribbles of a terrified boy. Matthew's story had finally been told, but the horror it uncovered was far from over. Matthew's notebook described, in chilling detail, the man who had taken him. He referred to him only as the man with yellow teeth. The nickname appeared again and again throughout the entries, a name rooted in a child's observation, yet heavy with dread. Matthew never gave the man a real name, but the image painted through his words was unforgettable. He wrote that the man smelled like old water and something burnt. His breath, he said, smelled like rotting leaves and smoke. And when he talked, it sounded like someone whispering through gravel. His voice, Matthew wrote, hurt my ears. In one entry, he said the man claimed to live under the street. It wasn't clear what that meant, but Matthew seemed to take it literally. He described him crawling through tunnels, surfacing through grates, and watching from drains. Whether these images were the result of Matthew's deteriorating state of mind or a terrifying reality remained uncertain. What was clear was that Matthew believed it deeply, and for a child trapped alone, that belief was everything. The boy was held in what he called the dark room where the walls moved. That phrase appeared repeatedly throughout the notebook. Some experts speculated it could have been a small chamber in the drainage system, possibly modified, hidden beneath infrastructure no one had checked in decades. Matthew didn't seem to understand the place he was in. He described it in fragments: dripping noises, cold air, the smell of wet cement, and the way the walls made sounds when no one touched them. He said they made clicking and scratching noises, as if things were alive behind them. He wrote about hearing other voices. Sometimes they were distant, sometimes close. He said he heard crying, whispering, even screaming. He never saw anyone else, but he believed others were nearby. In one note he asked, "Is someone there? Please talk to me. I'm scared too." But there was never a response. The fear in his words was palpable. Some entries read like panicked letters to whoever might one day read them. He begged for help again and again. "I don't know where I am," he wrote. "Please come. I don't want to die here. Please find me. Please tell my mom I love her." These pleas were scattered across the notebook, sometimes written twice, even 3 times in a row, as though repeating them might increase the chances someone would hear. As the entries continued, his thoughts became more scattered. He described how the man would disappear for long stretches, sometimes hours, sometimes days. During those times, Matthew was left alone in the dark. He was cold. He had no food. He said he could hear rats moving near him, scratching and scurrying along the floor. He described the sound of dripping water and distant thuds that shook the walls. He said he once saw something crawling on the ceiling, but it was too dark to know what it was. One entry mentioned the man speaking to himself. Matthew wrote that the man mumbled things like, "She's still down here, and the walls don't like it when they scream." Whether these were the delusions of a mentally unstable captor or figments of Matthew's own crumbling psyche was impossible to tell. But every word was soaked in fear and desperation. The notebook never explained exactly how Matthew had been taken. The early pages suggested he had been grabbed while riding home from school. One line said, "He was hiding behind the fence. He waited. I didn't see him until he ran." There was mention of a bag, of something tight around his face. He described the smell of gasoline and plastic, and then waking up in the dark. After that, The entries became a diary of captivity, written by a child trying to stay alive, trying to be found. Toward the end of the notebook, the entries became increasingly short, disjointed, and emotionally fragmented. The cold was mentioned more frequently. So was hunger. He wrote about missing his parents, his dog, the taste of peanut butter sandwiches. He said he dreamed about his bedroom, about sunlight, about the sound of cartoons on Saturday morning. Then came the final page. The handwriting was different, shakier, uneven, barely legible in places. The lines slanted, and some words were cut off mid-letter. The ink was smudged in streaks, as if wiped by trembling fingers or wet with tears. I think he left. I can't hear him anymore. I'm so cold. That was all. The page ended there. Just 5 words that carried the weight of 45 years of grief. Words that had been written by a child who had waited as long as he could before losing all hope. The simple, haunting acknowledgement of his reality, that no one was coming, that he was going to die alone, was more devastating than any report or photograph could ever capture. Investigators and forensic psychologists who examined the notebook were unanimous in their assessment. This was not just evidence. It was a record of suffering, preserved in real time by someone too young to fully understand the horror he was enduring. It was the written voice of a boy who knew no one could hear him, but hoped someone one day would. The smudges on the page told their own story. There were fingerprint impressions barely visible, shaped like tiny crescents. Some analysts believed they were marks from Matthew's fingers. Others said they were tears wiped away quickly. The ink had run slightly in the lower corner, the way it does when moisture meets old paper. That last page became the most powerful piece of evidence in the entire case. It was proof of intent, proof of a timeline, and proof that Matthew had been aware, until the very end, of what was happening to him. The image of those final words, written in the fading strength of a dying child's hand, left a mark on everyone involved. Police officers cried. Reporters paused their stories. Parents, especially, were shaken. The very idea that a young boy had spent his last moments writing not for himself, but for someone, anyone, who might find his words one day, shattered people's sense of comfort. The phrase, "I'm so cold," became symbolic. It echoed across social media and candlelight vigils. Artists painted it into murals. Activists adopted it as a call to action for missing children's programs. That simple statement, so basic, so human, cut through time like a knife. Matthew had written in the dark, hungry, alone, his fingers shaking as he recorded what he thought might be his final moments. And until that last moment, he held on to the belief that maybe someone would read it, that someone would understand what had happened, that maybe, just maybe, the truth would come out one day. It did, but it came too late to save him. And what was left behind was more than just a notebook. It was a haunting reminder of how fragile life can be, how easily a voice can be lost in the dark, and how, sometimes, even the smallest words can echo for decades. Here is the 1,000-word expansion of the paragraph, fully immersing in the rediscovery of the case, Howard Miller's memory, and the emotional impact, without using any bold words. Authorities reopened the case with fresh eyes. The discovery of Matthew Clark's remains, along with the heartbreaking contents of his notebook, had ignited a storm of attention and urgency. The town's police department, long considered under-equipped to handle a case of such depth and age, found itself overwhelmed by media scrutiny, federal oversight, and the emotional weight of a community shaken to its core. Detectives who had once considered the Clark case closed or unsolvable were pulled out of retirement. New specialists were brought in: cold case units, forensic anthropologists, child psychology experts, and criminal profilers assembled to try and piece together the puzzle left unfinished for over 4 decades. They began with the basics, reviewing every detail from 1980. re-examining the initial statements, the photos, the overlooked reports. Every piece of evidence was pulled from storage, some of it yellowed, some of it barely legible, and laid out like fragments of a time capsule cracked open by force. It was a race to trace the past before it faded again. Not long into the process, someone came forward. His name was Howard Miller, a quiet, unassuming man in his late 80s, living in a modest care home just outside of Dyersville. In the 1980s, he had worked for the city's public works department, primarily as a sewer maintenance technician. He had been in charge of inspecting storm drains, manholes, underground pipelines, and infrastructure that most people preferred to forget existed. His work had taken him all over the town, above and below ground, for more than 2 decades. Howard was in declining health by the time authorities reached him. His voice was thin, and his hands trembled with every movement. But when an officer, gently asking about any strange incidents from that time, mentioned the old drainage tunnel, the one recently uncovered, Howard's face changed. He went still. Then he said, almost in a whisper, "I saw him. I saw a man crawl out of that tunnel." The officers leaned in, not quite believing what they were hearing. It had been 45 years. No one had ever said anything about a man inside the tunnel. But Howard continued, his eyes distant, as if watching the memory unfold behind them. "He was covered in filth," he said. "Mud, grease, water. Smelled like rot and something dead. I was doing my route down near the storm catch. I remember it was raining a bit. Not heavy, just enough to make the roads slick. I was by the eastern grate, checking the runoff flow, when I heard something. At first, I thought it was just an animal. You hear things down there all the time. But this was different. It was slower, heavier." He paused, his breath catching slightly. Then he came out, crawling, hands first, then his shoulders, then the rest of him. He looked like he'd been living down there. Skin pale, clothes torn, hair soaked, and he was carrying something. I couldn't see it clearly. It was small, wrapped in something. Could have been a bundle, could have been a body. I didn't know. Howard looked at the officers. His eyes, aged and wet with regret, told them what his words didn't. "I didn't report it," he said quietly. "I thought I was seeing things. You don't know how easy it is to second-guess yourself when you're working in the dark all day. I didn't want people to laugh, or think I was losing it." One of the officers, without saying a word, reached into a folder and pulled out a photograph. It was of the small, red toy car recovered from Matthew's backpack. The one that had been found near his remains, partially buried in the chamber. The sticker on the side was still peeling, the front wheel still missing. The officer handed the photo to Howard and waited. Howard stared at the image. His hand began to shake. "That's it," he said after a long moment. His voice broke on the words. "That's what he was holding. That little car. I remember the color. I remember the shape." He had it in his hand, pressed to his chest like it mattered. Then Howard burst into tears. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was the quiet, exhausted sob of a man who had carried something unspoken for far too long. The room was silent, except for the rhythmic beeping of medical equipment and the occasional sniffle as he wiped his eyes with the corner of the hospital sheet. The officers didn't press him further. There was nothing else to say. He had told them everything he could, everything he remembered, everything that had haunted him for the better part of his life. They thanked him, gently, respectfully, and before leaving, one of them asked why he never mentioned it sooner. Howard stared at the ceiling. "I don't know," he said. "I guess I didn't want it to be real. I thought, if I forgot it, it wouldn't matter. But it mattered, didn't it?" They nodded. It mattered. Howard passed away a week later. The officers returned to the care home with flowers and left them by his bedside. They didn't tell the press about his statement. Not at first. It was personal. Private, a final confession from a man who had held onto a terrible memory for nearly half a century. But what he gave them, the image of that figure crawling from the tunnel, the description, the confirmation of the toy car, was invaluable. It meant there had been a witness. Someone had seen the man. Someone had almost intervened. His testimony triggered a deeper investigation into the maintenance records from the 1980s. Old work orders, inspection logs, any staff complaints or sightings of suspicious activity. They interviewed other former employees, though most were now elderly or deceased. A few recalled Howard talking about seeing shadows back in the day. One remembered him mentioning something about a rat man once half-jokingly, during a break at the depot. But no one had ever taken it seriously. Now, they were listening. For the first time, the man with yellow teeth became more than a terrifying scribble in a lost child's notebook. He became a presence in the real world, dirty, silent, crawling from the dark. He had existed. He had been seen. And someone had known, even if they had been too afraid to speak. Howard Miller's words, spoken at the end of his life, helped shape the next phase of the investigation. He gave a face, however blurry, to the monster that had haunted Dyersville for decades. He gave weight to Matthew's words, and he reminded the world that even the quietest truths, spoken too late, can still change everything. No one truly knows who the man with yellow teeth was. There was no fingerprint match in any database. No arrests. No known offenders in the region who resembled the descriptions pulled from Matthew's notebook. There were no confirmed sightings before or after Matthew's disappearance, and no witnesses who could provide a name, an address, or even a face. It was as if he had never existed outside of the words of a scared little boy, scribbled in a notebook found decades too late. And yet, somehow, everyone believed in him. He had become more than just a man. He was now a myth, a symbol of something darker lurking just beneath the surface of a quiet, trusting town. The man with yellow teeth. The name itself sent a shiver down people's spines, not because of what it revealed, but because of what it left unsaid. Yellow teeth implied decay, age, something uncared for. He wasn't clean. He wasn't new. He was old, rotting from within, and yet still capable of terrible, deliberate cruelty. Some believed he had lived in the tunnels for years, that perhaps he had once been a resident of Dyersville himself. A man who slipped through the cracks, became homeless or mentally unstable, and retreated into the darkness beneath the town. The drainage system in Dyersville was extensive, built decades ago with little documentation. There were abandoned routes, blocked-off chambers, and forgotten corridors no longer mapped on the city's records. It was entirely possible that someone could live down there for long periods unseen, surviving on scraps or stolen food. Others believed that Matthew was not his only victim. This theory began quietly, but grew louder over time. Locals started connecting dots, looking into other missing persons cases, some from nearby towns, some from decades past. In the 1970s, a girl named Elise Moreno vanished from a town just 30 miles west. She was 12. Her case was never solved. In 1982, two brothers from a farming community south of Dyersville were said to have gone missing while exploring the woods. Some assumed they had drowned in a nearby river, but no remains were ever found. When details from Matthew's notebook were released to law enforcement across the region, some of the parents of those missing children reached out to investigators, wondering if their children had also fallen victim to the same man. The notebook described hearing voices, crying, screaming. Matthew had believed others were nearby. Some thought those entries were hallucinations brought on by fear and isolation. But what if they weren't? It was a question no one wanted to answer. If Matthew wasn't the only one, then how many children had died down there, never to be found, their stories left buried under concrete and silence? The investigation widened. Old case files were reopened, But answers remained elusive. No additional remains were found. No further evidence surfaced, and so the man with yellow teeth remained nameless, faceless, and unpunished. An urban legend with a horrifying grain of truth at its center. But one thing became painfully, undeniably real. Matthew Clark had suffered. He had written his own account of what had happened, and his words lived on long after his voice was gone. Those words changed the town forever. People who read the notebook, even parts of it, reported feeling haunted by it. Not in the supernatural sense, but emotionally, deeply. The way Matthew described the cold, the silence, the fear, the pleading in his tone, the gradual decline of hope. His last sentence, written with fading strength, was etched into the memory of everyone who saw it. "I think he left. I can't hear him anymore. I'm so cold." No line from a horror story could match the raw power of that simple truth. The words of a dying child, alone in the dark. Schools in Dyersville started using the story as a reminder of why safety mattered. Stranger danger lessons were reframed. Students were told to never walk home alone. Community watch programs were revived. There was a renewed urgency in keeping children visible, accounted for, and protected. People locked their doors earlier. They paid more attention. The town would never return to the way it was before 1980. Not fully. And so, 45 years after Matthew's disappearance, the town finally did something they had never done. They acknowledged the boy in public. For decades, his story had lived in the shadows, whispered about, debated, passed from one generation to the next like a cautionary tale. But now, finally, there would be a place. A permanent place. A memorial. It was placed directly above the drainage tunnel where Matthew's bike had been found. The tunnel itself had long since been sealed, reinforced with concrete and iron bars. No one could enter it now, not even wildlife. But above it, near the slope where weeds once grew tall and undisturbed, the city cleared a space. Grass was trimmed, benches were installed, flowers were planted. A small path was laid so people could walk quietly to the site and pay their respects. At the center stood a stone plaque. Not grand or flashy, just a clean, dark granite slab with a single inscription carved deep into its surface. "You were never forgotten. Your story was finally heard." The plaque didn't include a name, but it didn't need to. Everyone in Dyersville knew who it was for. And as word spread, visitors from outside the town began to arrive. Some left flowers, some left notes, others left small toys, cars, action figures, folded drawings, items that echoed the ones found in Matthew's backpack. One morning, someone left a candle burning in a glass jar beside the plaque. Just one flame. It burned through the early hours, flickering softly in the breeze. When the sun rose over the town, casting golden light across the stone, it looked almost like the light was coming from underground, like the boy's voice was still reaching upward through the earth. People gathered that day. Some came alone. Some brought children. An older man, likely a retired teacher, stood for a long time without saying a word. A young woman whispered a prayer. A mother with a toddler in her arms quietly wiped tears from her cheeks. They didn't need speeches. They didn't need ceremony. The words on the stone said everything. You were never forgotten. For years, people had moved on, grown older, changed, but somewhere, deep inside, the guilt and grief had remained. And now, with this simple gesture, the town had spoken not just to the boy who never made it home, but to the generations who had lived under the weight of that silence. Your story was finally heard. That story, buried for 45 years, had finally risen to the surface. Not just in evidence and media coverage, but in hearts, in memories, in the collective conscience of a town that had tried for too long to forget what it couldn't explain. And in the quiet that settled around the memorial, as the wind rustled through the grass and birds passed overhead. The town finally found something it hadn't felt in decades: peace.